Welcome to Access Europe, the May 2023 meeting. And as you can see, we have a fellow UK developer, Peter Bryant, who is the owner of Corylus Business Systems. Peter is going to be talking to us about the method he's used for many years of connecting clients to SQL Server, and that is DSN-less connections, and how you can automate that to make it a one-off process, and then they just reconnect from there onwards. So without further ado, I'm going to let Peter introduce himself.
Okay, I've actually got a slide that will talk a bit more about me, so I'll just dive straight in. Hopefully this is going to be about half and half slides and demo, and if anything, I'll lean to more towards demo and code walkthrough than slides, because you can always read them afterwards. So I put this all up in one go. There's no need to read everything here. You can look at it afterwards if you find it of any interest. But basically, I'm long in the tooth, and I've been using Access ever since, but I don't regard the bit in red that I'm being necessarily an expert. I'm an expert in the bits I do and do well, but that doesn't mean I know I'm a wide-ranging expert, but I'm happily competent. I'm very good at looking things up when I don't know how to do them. The agenda, again, we'll both do this quite quickly. Those are the areas I'm going to cover, and then obviously demo at the end. So the primary goals for me was I was fed up relinking databases on client sites because it always seemed to get into difficulties and creating DSNs. You'd use the wrong driver or not get through to the right database or have the wrong permissions or something like that. So it was always a bit of a pain in the neck, and it was a friction point in deployments. And it's always in front of the customer, so that can always be embarrassing if it doesn't work properly, much like demos that don't work, as we may or may not see later. So the goal is to send them a compiled front end that they just run, and to avoid looping around DSN creation and management and everything else that you need to do to get things to work. I'm going to go through some assumptions that I've made when preparing this presentation, and also a bit of description about the infrastructure within which I'm working. Firstly, there's a lie on this page, and this is it. Demo code will be 32-bit. 64-bit is fine, but with a caveat in that I was just testing this afternoon 64-bit code, and it didn't want to play ball. I don't know whether that's a security issue with SQL, whether it's a code issue or something else. So I won't demo 64-bit, and I wasn't planning to anyway, but I was just preparing a 64-bit version of, and it ain't working. So that will come out a bit later. But I have used it in both 32 and 64-bit worlds with clients, so I know it can work. I assume you know how to set up a DSN connection to SQL. This works with 2008, at least as old as 2008 R2 and beyond. I haven't got any SQL environment older than that to test with anymore, but I've been using it since, I think, SQL 2000, if not earlier. I generally use 19 Express these days because most of my clients are SMEs. They don't need to spend thousands of pounds on SQL Server and licenses. Express does the job perfectly well enough for them. And I'm generally stuck on SSMS 18 because the downloads are so damn big. I've been doing this since at least Access 2007, actually been older. This has proven, I'm sorry, I proved it as old as 2000, at least 2003, if not 2000. But my consistent, I know it still works, is 2007 Access and SQL 2008, and I have some VMs with those old versions around just in case. But the main thing to say there is that no upgrade, either Access or SQL, has broken things for me. Although today's 64-bit might be the second lie on this slide, but I don't think it will. I think I've just got to a typo or something. An important MB. This is an environment largely for sort of SMEs approaching quite large MEs, but they exist in a world where they don't have much in the way of IT staff around. They're not particularly focused on application security, so we're not dealing with environments where there's a very complicated security profile on SQL Server. We use trusted connections, and generally speaking, that means domain users have got read-write permissions to the database, and they just connect with the app. And the users don't even know how to create an ODBC connection from Excel, let alone do it and attempt to hack the system. That may be a problem for some of you in particularly large environments, but there are other ways of doing this, which you'll be able to see in the code, and I'll do a walkthrough where you can actually use a different security profile. But in the main, my environment is trusted connections from domain users into the SQL Server, and the application controls what they have access to, which is a whole nother presentation that I do as well, where you can control who can do what by their Active Directory group membership, which is something I quite like to do as well, because it means IT support can change group membership and things just change in the app. There's nothing that I have to do within the app to make it change. trust is not an everything must be totally secure world. There are compromises everywhere, and you will need to apply, if you want to do this and you like it, you will need to apply it in the context of your particular client or product or project. But there are changes you can make to change the security that you're using. So establishing connections, when I do this, the first time I connect the database, I'll do a one-time connect to the backend tables of the DSN if I haven't used an upgrading tool to do it for me. You only need to have that first DSN for each SQL database. It's normally on your network and it's normally just one database, but this does expand to be able to connect to multiple servers and multiple databases. I'm partly showing that today. It might be possible to avoid the setup costs, but I just couldn't be bothered. And it's never been a make or break thing. So creating the first DSN does check at least you can see the data and get through the security of the database connection. So if you've got a new SQL server and you haven't set up security to it properly and you can't connect through, trying to create the DSN at least proves that you've got a database issue, not application issue. There are 4 tables, local tables in the application that allow you to control what's going on. Though in fact, this table is actually 2 tables because you've got a local and a backend version ID table. Single record just says what the version number is. It's hardly sophisticated, but it just does a lookup of the local version number and the backend version number. It compares them. If they're different, tells the user to go away and they need to sort something out. You'll see that used a bit later in the demo. I use it mainly for schema changes. So if I know something's different, particularly if you've got new tables, I do try and increment the version number every time. Occasionally on very big front-end changes, even if there's no schema, I'll do a version change as well, so you know that the latest version's out. The way I deploy applications is that there's a master copy on the network somewhere, and users just run a process that copies it down to the local machine. They run it from there, so they get a fresh version every time, which avoids front-end bloat, and also ensures you make one deployment change, everybody gets a new version. The local networks table is key, and this one presentation of it is slightly different because I'm not going to demonstrate on multiple networks. I'm just going to demonstrate the mechanism that I use to move between networks. But in the main, what you have here is a list of NetBIOS domain names in the middle column. So Coreless is my business, and then client domain might be in the middle. And occasionally I work with a third party, so their domain might be in there as well. And then the third column is the instance name of the SQL server to which I want to connect. Now, it doesn't have to be SQL, it could be other things, as you'll see in the code later. But in the main, this is about the processes. What domain am I on? What SQL server should I be connected to? And then connect if I'm not. That's the basic process that how it works. I say here there's a little bit of embedded security here, in that if someone grabs the application and puts it on a different network, it won't run, because it fails at this lookup stage, doesn't find a server, so can't reconnect. Obviously, it's a local table, they can hack it. And again, it's one of those things that it's more work that isn't going to pay back really. Could put internal data in the application somewhere or hard code it, but it's just creating different problems to solve. And in the environment in which I work, this is more than sufficient, because to make this work, they'd have to nick the database and the front end. If they'd done that, there are bigger problems going on with the client than your network security. Sorry, your application security. And as I said at the beginning of this slide, this table is a demo with a compromise to make it work for this demonstration. But you'll see very clearly what to do. The other table that I've got here is local database names, and this is designed for the environment where you have multiple instances of the same data system on your clients or possibly on your network. So, for instance, test, UAT, and live. And this table gives the ability to switch between them from the same front end, assuming they're at the same version level. I generally find it most useful when I'm actually doing upgrades. So if I'm moved from version 3 to 4, I'll have done that on test first, recompiled it and worked it all. I'll then do the schema changes on UAT, take the test system front end, and then just reconnect it to the UAT back end. And then I've got my new front end for UAT. Admin users do have the ability to flip between different systems if they need to. But what we found is that users tend to just use one of 3 different copies that we have on the network for them to use. So I'm not using test UAT in live here, so I'm using CD and vinyl, which you'll see why later. I will be revealing some musical preferences later on in this demonstration. As said there, they can fit, subject to the version number being the same, they can flip between different database backends and front end. But as it turns out, my users don't use it much. I use it for deployment. And I do secure that so only admin users can have the privilege of switching between that front end, between data backends. Lastly, this table is really a scratch table. It's just a list of all the databases database tables that I've got locally with their remote name and the remote database, so that I can then quickly reconnect them all to the new database. Temporary table, so you don't need to think too much about this. It's just part of the mechanism for doing the change. Debug form. Most of my apps, I have a debug form. So here at the top, I've got the SQL server to which they're connected, the database on that SQL server to which they're connected, and then an option of changing. So this is where you'd see test live in UAT, and you say I want to click on the button change DB, and it will allow them to change the backend to which they're connected. The change SQL server is an entirely temporary thing in order to simulate changing networks as part of the demonstration. So you'll see that later. And then below that, I have a bunch of fields that just give me some feedback information about how users are connected, what machine am I, and a lot of parameter values here. So for instance, if they select an order, I'll put the order number in there. If I select a client, I'll put the client number in there further down on the screen, just so they've got some immediate feedback on, or I've got some immediate feedback when they give me a screen grab or something didn't work. So over to the demonstration time. Firstly, quick explanation of SQL. This is all being done on a cluster of Hyper-V VMs on a network called Static Dev, which is my development environment. They all sit behind a single domain controller and remote RAS server. So they're isolated from my main network, and I just terminal serve into them in order to work on the machines, which means that they're off my main computer, and I don't do any development on my main computer. It's all over there. In that environment, there are multiple SQL servers, and in this instance, I'm using SQL 2014 and 2019, demonstrate back and flip between different instances of server. And there's the musical preference coming through. One server's got Marillion data about Marillion music on it, and the other has King Crimson listings. And within each database, I have SQL. Within SQL Server, I've got two databases, CD and Vinyl. Although, as I say, there it's really anything that isn't CD. And these all have the same schema. So I've effectively got 4 different backends to which I can connect across 2 different servers. When access starts, I have a default form that's hidden that loads up and does all the various initiation stuff. And then I have a debug form, which in this instance, I'm forcing it onto the screen every time, but it allows users to see that debug information or not if they want. And then I load the main form. So I've got 5 different versions here that demonstrate the key features I want to show, and I'm just going to work through them one at a time. So this is what they get when they load a system and it's connected to the wrong server. So this is simulating my front end being taken to the client network, and it discovers it's on a different domain. And that's where that shows up here in the middle. So I show them the domain they're on, the database to which it should be connected, and the server to which it should connect. So I've looked up in, I'll do that first. Tells them they've done the switch, and that's it. It's loaded. So what it's done is looked up from this column here, the domain on which I'm working, and it's looked up there, the server to which I should connect. That's what I've simulated. So that's the experience of when you log on for the first time. And this database is all CDs, King Crimson, of which there are quite a few. And as I put it there, the only thing this app does is quit. So the next demo version is where I've got the wrong version. I'm also on the wrong database. So I'm reconnecting again. It switches, and then it does the version check, and they're out of step. So it tells them to go back to the user. Go back to IT. Dumps out. Here we're on the right database, but we've got the wrong version. Wrong version number, bounces me out. And then finally, we've got the right version on the right network. So it just loads. So that's the experience. Once they've reconnected their system once, they'll just run this and get it. So what I'm going to show now is what happens to the process of flipping. So I'm currently looking at CDs, a database called CDs, on a server, Mobile SQL Express, which is a 2019 instance. And I've got two databases I connect. So if I want to say connect to Vinyl instead, you just click on change database. Are you sure you want to switch it? Yeah, I am. Done it. And there we go. So this is all the non-CD stuff, mostly Vinyl, but other things as well. So that's the equivalent of changing from your test system to your live system to your UAT system. This is the process of simulating changing the network on which it's running. So I'm, for instance, moving from my network to the client. So I'm just going to move from King Crimson to Meridian. And it's a very similar process. Are you sure? Yep. Okay, I've done it. And there's Meridian data. And then finally, flip back to CDs. Yep. There we go. CDs. So that's the process working. I've simulated changing the backend database that I'm working with, and also changed the network when it's running. So the important thing is how it does that. And that's where I've got this was. So I put some stop codes into this just to halt the processing and then walk you through the code, which is what I want to do now.
Can I just pause you for a second?
Yep.
And just give people a chance if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Yeah, sure.
Right before we move ahead. There's nothing in the chat at the moment. Does anyone want to ask any questions? If you do, please switch your microphones on.
Hi guys, it's Steve. How are you doing, everybody?
Hi, Steve.
Hi Pete, how you doing, mate? Hope you're well. Do you do much in testing to see if the server's actually there first? Because sometimes I've noticed that if you've got a server that's not physically running, or you're on a network that's not available, the code almost takes 2 or 3 seconds to work out that the network's not there before it then returns back an error or whatever that you can check on. I have seen certain bits of code around on the nets with different places of different ways of checking. That's something you come across.
Yes, I have come across it, and it's not been a regular occurrence. So I haven't incorporated any, or haven't written any code to deal with that, because it's normally self-evident and it's a deployment time. So if there's if the UAT database isn't up and running and I'm switching to UAT, it's normally me that finds out that's the case. And if they've detached the database or anything like that, I would normally be the person to find it rather than the users. If the SQL server goes down and they start the app and nothing happens, from a selfish point of view, I'm not too bothered about that, because it's someone else's problem. If it crashes a bit, it will crash, not very gracefully, but they'll be aware of, the client's generally aware of other problems going on at the same time. So it's not a situation in which I would want to try and recover and just carry on working. So in a way, it crashing is the right thing to do, because it then invokes a support call either to me or to their IT support company.
Yeah,
so
it was
something's gone wrong.
It was just really the hang time for a second or so, where it tries to interrogate the network and almost tries, so many times before it finds the network.
I did develop code to check whether the SQL Server was running. To be honest, it was more a case of in my development machine rather than a client where it would be using a server, as in me having a local copy. And it was so obvious that SQL Server wasn't running, because basically the whole database would hang for 30 seconds. So it was a matter of trapping that. But I couldn't find a way of speeding up my code to trap it any faster than it going through everything over and over again. So I'm not sure if it's worth it. I think I agree with Peter. It's a bit like he was saying with some of the earlier security checks. You could build in lots of additional code, but it really isn't worth it 90% of the time, especially if you hide navigation panes and ribbons and so on.
I normally check on a table, but it still takes a couple of seconds if the database is not available.
Can I ask a related question? And it's about you mentioned 30 seconds, Colin.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is that not an ODBC setting that you could change in your connection code?
You might be right. Yeah. 1500 sounds familiar. Yeah.
So you could then set it to just at the beginning stage of your code.
Yeah.
Set it to like 1 second. Because generally, or even 2 or 3 seconds, whatever you're really comfortable, it would come within if it were alive at all, even on a wireless blah-de-blah sort of network.
Yeah.
And then when you've got all the connections that you want, then set it back to 30 seconds.
Yeah, good idea. I will try that. I made a note to do that. I don't know why I've never thought of doing that. Anyway, Peter, apologies. Back to you.
So, as I said, they check and refresh about just maintaining the current connection. So it's something I only tend to do. My clients don't do it very often. If I walk you through the process, you start to see somewhere how the data structures are used, and it'll lead up to the bigger stuff of actually doing the changes. So stepping through, I've got a function that checks all the tables I connect to the same DSN. Historically, and I'm going back a long time, there were situations where the relinking would be, for some reason, be partial. And I think that was an application, sorry, not an application, I think that was an Access or SQL issue that I was experiencing. So I wrote this bit of code and left it in there, and over probably the last decade, I've never used it. But it basically goes through all the tables and checks they've got the same DSN connection. And when I say DSN, what I mean is SQL Server name and backend database name. So we'll just perform that very quickly. As there's only 2 backend tables, it won't take too long. There's only 1 loop. So first of all, that local table I build. So I empty it, connect to it, and then go through the table definitions in my database. And I'm looking for any definition that has ODBC in the connection string, which basically means it's a remote table rather than local. Having done that, I add a record to my local table that just takes the name, the backend data name, and then finds the actual database to which it's connected, which is a function within a function within a function at the moment. So I've got here, I'm looking for table backend version, and I'm grabbing the connection string for that table, which should now show there. Just put that up. So there's the full string of the connection. And what I'm looking for that is the word is the text string database equals. So I find that, get the location of that in the string, and when I say I find is some of this code was taken from other people, so, and I will give them acknowledgements at the end. But because I found database equals, I shift forward 9 characters in the string, and that gets me the backend database name here. The string database now is, you can see it's called CD, and then it's got the semicolon and everything else beyond it in the path. And then I just find that semicolon and strip out everything beyond it. So that means my connection database, if I hover over there, is CD. So I know that this database, sorry, this local link is connected to a backend database called CD, and then I store that. So I've now got, it's a table called backend. It's in a backend database called dbo.backend, and in a database called CD. And I repeat that for all tables. And of course, it's iterating through all the local ones, so I'll just spin onto there. So I've now got a local table, and you can see it's been done many times because I'm onto 9700 records. So I've got 2 local tables. That's the remote table name, and that's the remote database name. I come out of that function. So I've built my table of all the connections I have in my database. I now pick up this is the value in the debug form, which is here, that SQL Server there, mobile SQL / SQL Express. And my apologies, it's not that value, it's the database name here, CD. I'm now reading that table, and I'm checking the backend database that's in that table matches the database name I got on that form, and counting the times it goes wrong. And at this point, that should be 0. Yep. So what that now means is every record in this table has in this column the value CD, which matches the database name on this debug form. So I know that everything's good. Come out of that, and that's where it tests the result. So was it 0? Yes. Tell the user everything's good. So the usefulness of this function is relatively low, but what it's allowed me to show you is that how I build the list of all the tables to which I'm connected in the backend server, and I know which database they're from. So the refresh is a similar process, but it actually then forces a refresh of that connection. So for instance, if you've regenerated a SQL view, and I'm trying to remember the precise circumstances when I did this, but there's a point where you need to refresh the connection if you've got different columns in the SQL view. So it's kind of unusual circumstance, but this is quite a useful mechanism to say, instead of, you can right click this, refresh the link on the individual table, but this will just refresh all the links of all the tables. So usual kind of, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I am. If they say yes. Right, now this is an important piece of code to note for if you want to apply it to your environment. What I'm doing here is, I've got the first line of code is what you would actually normally do. And this is where I'm looking up in the table local networks, this one here. I'm looking up the local domain name, and then I'm determining what the SQL Server should be. But because I'm not switching between domains, I've hardwired it to say, just grab the local server as it is, which is that line there. So that line of code can be deleted, and it's that you'd want to actually use in real life. And you'll also notice here that is SQL Server 1. This is preparing the ground for if you've got more than one SQL Server involved. And I have had this once. A large NHS trust had an app they wanted upsizing from Access to SQL, and they had a application database server, and they also had another server which held sort of trust-wide data, so information about users, permissions, things like that, and we had to interrogate that for master information about I was going to say customers, I mean patients and staff. So my reconnection process had to work to two different servers with two different database names, and this is the way to do it, in that you can have more than one column in that table, which is what I did there. Now in this instance, they're the same values, but that could easily be a different server or a different instance on the same server, even that can happen. So that's, for those of you less familiar with SQL, you can have effectively multiple SQL servers on the same machine, and they have an instance name, and that is the instance name, and that's the full path of the SQL server. So that's how you do it in real life. For purposes of my demo, I'm hardwiring it to the server that I already know I'm connected. And then I've got a function here we've not gone through before, which is attaching those tables. So what I've got here is, that's the server to which I want to connect. That's the backend database name. Locations is a misnomer. It should be a string DB name, I think. But I've only just spotted that today after 15 years or so. I may change it. So this function will do a similar thing. It's going to rebuild that local connection table again, and tell me to what everything is connected. But then it'll do something different. So I'm going to spin onto this bit here. Now this is the connection string for your database. So there's a server name here, a database name there, and it's the stub of everything you need to make a connection. This is where, as I said here, and I've left, this will be in the version that you get. So I'll put it in bold to make it more obvious, hopefully. This is where if you're using different drivers, maybe even different backend databases, you can change, as long as you know what the string should look like, which you're going to integrate from the link table manager here. Once you've made the connection, there's your string, or information for you to build your string. Then this allows you to build the basic standard connection string, which is then used later on. So we built, this table has been rebuilt, and it's got a list of our backend database tables and their front end name and the server on which they're, and the database on which they're connected. This determines the server to which you want to connect and that database name. And then I'm going to loop through those tables and reconnect. And I'll do it so that we can, and step through the code so you can see what's going on. So until we get to the end of the local table. So I grab the column values from local name, remote name, database name. There. The last thing here, before we move on to actually change anything, is to grab any indexes. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because when you reconnect a SQL view, if you do it manually, you'll be asked which is the column or which group of columns constitute a unique index for each row in that table, so that the SQL view then becomes an updatable SQL view. If you don't specify that, the view will be read-only and you can't change anything. Most of my apps use views for changing data, because I then supply the user with just the data they need. So it's important to recreate those indices, which if you just do a refresh, you would have to do manually. So by refresh, I mean right click refresh link here. And I haven't got a view here to show it to you, I'm afraid. This process captures that index value or definition and allows you to reapply it when you reconnect. So I assume that it doesn't have an index. And then if it's got one, then it will be either a table with only one index or a SQL view, because that will only have the SQL view will only have a one index as far as access is concerned. So what I'm doing here is building a standard string, which is effectively the SQL code to rebuild that index on that table. So this is captured. This was a hard slog by Andy, and then also refined by me. This is where we had one bug, and I do mention this later in the slides. The name of an index, but like all good naming conventions, probably shouldn't have any spaces in it. If it does, you need to encapsulate it with a square bracket either side, so that it knows that that field, that name is good. For many years, that code, those brackets weren't in the code, and it never caused a problem. And then I think it was the NHS Trust actually. It suddenly started crashing, and what we found out was that someone had created an index with an index name with a space in it, and that was causing the crash. So the code was revised to include these square brackets, and from then on, which is now 5 or 6 years, it hasn't been a problem since. But it's one of those gotchas I think good devs wouldn't leave any spaces in the first place. I have a natural resistance to that, but when you find it, it's a bit disturbing. The other thing is, having grabbed the actual index, it actually puts pluses in there, which you need to replace with blanks, and it has semicolons. So if I step that once, and show you, so there's the create index on blah blah blah. You've got plus in there. If I step through those two changes and do the same again, it's now good. That will create my index for me. So I've now captured up here the name, the details of the table when I connect. This has captured whether there's an index or not and what it is. And then the next step is, rather than just delete and recreate, what I do is rename the table by putting a tilde before and after the name. This is useful if it crashes midway the process, because it tells you the last table that was done, because it will have been renamed and then it won't have been recreated. So it gives you a starting point for investigation. So if this happens to you, if you're using this code, the tildes tell you where the table that was wrong. You then need to rename it back without it. And once you fix the problem, then rerun the code, it'll be fine. So what we're doing here, rename the table. And then this code is recreating the table using pending the table def. So I've got the local names backend version, system value, remote table name, and then that's my connection string that I built earlier that points specifically to that database on that particular SQL instance. And then we need to rebuild the index if there was one previously present. So if I'd flagged it as having an index and my current index count is 0, the reason for that second test there is because if the index count is 1, it means I've relinked a backend table rather than a backend SQL view. Therefore, I don't need to do any index work. So I'll only get into this code if it's a SQL view and it's missing the index that it should have. And then all I do is execute the code that rebuilds that index, which was prepared here. So at this point, having completed that, I've renamed the old table. I've reconnected the table from the right database and on the right server with the right name, and rebuilt any indexes on it. So the last thing I do is remove the temporary table. So if it crashes somewhere in here, the temporary table still exists and give me that clue. So I'm going to just run to air, and then it'll repeat through the code. And then I tell the user, you've been switched to the database. So in this instance, I hadn't changed. It says switched. It really ought to say you have been refreshed. But again, it's not run very often. So, and to be honest, 99 users out of 100 won't even read that and spot the mistake. I'll just F5 to run that to completion. So what we've gone through there is checking where everything's connected to and refreshing everything. So the next step is then to just change the database to which I'm connected. So at the moment, we're connected to King Crimson CDs, and I'm going to switch to Vinyl. So the essential thing is, this is the same schema. This is like switching between your test database and your UAT database or your live database. The schema should all be the same. The version should all be the same. And the first two tests I've just passed through here are just to make sure they've selected a value and that it's not the same as the current location. So I don't go through a switch process if they've not changed anything. I then close the main menu if it's running, and I'll jump through the code that finds out whether it's loaded. The reason for that is just to make sure the forms end up being reloaded properly at the end of it. We had issues with refreshes and trying to sort of programmatically refresh it. I can't, again, a long time ago, it didn't work properly. So this was the mechanism to do it. And it feels quite reasonable to just refresh it, because there's, in some of our apps, I have color coding on the forms based on which database they're connected to. I grab numbers from other sources that way. This way, the main menu just comes back clean as a whistle with everything on it that should be for that particular database they're using. So I'll close it. And then this is, again, another point at which you normally look up the server to which you should be connected, but I'm hardwiring it for this, for demo purposes. And then we get the, are you certain you want to change the database? So I'm moving from CD to Vinyl, and I'm staying on the same database. So, sorry, staying on the same SQL server. If they do, then I'm actually going to go into the attaching process again. And this is the code that's already run. Or sorry, you've already seen run when doing the refresh. It's exactly the same process. It's just like a refresh. The only difference is that the database to which I'm connected is different. But this code is completely neutral, which is just a parameter that's passed in. And as you see, I'm specifying the server to which I want to connect and the database within that server. So I can use the same code for refreshing data, changing database, changing server. I've never written or used it to change both at the same time, but it could be done. So I'm going to pop out of that code because we've already been through it once. And then it says it's been switched to Vinyl. And what we should have is I store the version of the database to which I've now connected by finding which, and this is code that we've already seen again. I'm finding that database to which I've connected. I'm going to jump back out of that, check the version, and that's it done. And I'm now on King Crimson Vinyl again, of which is quite a lot, or well, Vinyl and downloads. So the last thing, and then just switching between databases. And this is pretty much a rinse and repeat of what I've already shown you. So I run through, make sure they are changing things, closing the menu, run to here. The server they want to do, I'll run it to here. So I'm asking, are you sure you want to change the SQL server? So what I'm doing now, I'm switching between Marillion and King Crimson content. If it's yes, I'm running that function again. So I'll just run through it. It tells me it's done. I change the recording on the debug form where I am by finding what I'm connected. Sorry, check the version. And then come out. Oop. So that's it. There we are on Marillion stuff. So the comment I make, I've been a Marillion fan since before they actually got a recording contract. And this particular 12-inch color vinyl did actually hit £60. I only paid 99p for it back in '82. And just for the sake of argument, I'm going to switch back to CDs, and I'm just going to F5 to run through it. There we go, Marillion CDs. So that's stepping through all the code. I believe, maybe even assert that it's reasonably well commented. I've certainly highlighted the areas where you will want to change things to suit your environment, be it one or more servers, and also the connection strings that you want to use. If you're using, as I do, the bog standard SQL Server driver, then you know that's going to be on any machine. If it's not, and you're using the SQL 11 native or any other driver, you would need to know that's on the machine that you're doing this work on. That may increase your workload, and it will certainly mean you need to change the connection strings that I'm building there, but they're easy enough to find from Link Table Manager. So with that, I'm going to close the app down and return to the slide deck. Any questions at that point while I pull this up.
There was one question from Neil Sargent.
It looked to me like you returned the fields collection from the index, and it seemed to return like a delimited string with pluses and semicolons in which you changed into commas.
Yes,
Is that right? That's a technique I wasn't aware of.
it's something I've not looked at for over a decade, but it was something we needed to do to make the string work.
No,
So,
I understand that, but
yeah.
I wouldn't have thought the fields collection would have been a string in the first place. It's a collection of fields. That's what I was confused by.
Can you show the code while you're discussing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll,
Sorry to interject.
no. Let me.
I would have thought it was a collection of field objects came back from the index, and you dealt with it as a string, and it appeared to.
Yes, I'm creating a SQL string to create the index, but the index is actually effectively local to the Access database. It's not a SQL Server index.
Yeah.
It's I can't simulate it here.
Refresh code. I saw.
Yeah, yeah. I'll find it.
I was just going to say, I mean, I do the same thing. It's one of the few, if you like, disadvantages of DSN-less connections that you can't easily specify an index on a view as you do the connection. So you have to do it in code afterwards.
Oh yeah,
And
I understand. I understand the principle about the indexes. What I didn't understand is that you seem to be getting a string back from a fields collection, which comes back as delimited by pluses and
Yes,
semicolons, which you then
yes.
turn into text.
Yeah. So in the comment immediately afterwards, you see that's what comes back with pluses
Alright.
and semicolons. And in order to execute the SQL code, you need to change it to comma separated and no pluses.
I would have thought you had to go through the fields collection, building a string for each field name. But it looks like you've taken a shortcut there, and the fields collection itself has returned a concatenated string.
Yeah.
Is that
It has.
something that happens in general in DAO fields or collections? This is just a technique I've not seen before. Adrian, anyone else?
I was totally unaware of that. Sorry to.
Yeah, am I right in saying that I would have thought that was a collection of field objects coming back for each index, and that you would do for each field in there, build a string from the field.name. But it looks like the fields collection itself, by some weird VBA defaulting, has come back as a
Yeah.
concatenated string, which you've then
Okay.
basically done a replacement on.
Yeah.
If so, that's a great technique that I was unaware of.
Right. So
it's exactly the one I've always used.
Mm.
In fact, I've got a page about it on my website,
there,
which I'm looking at now. It's exactly the same.
so
Is
there
that
you
a
go.
general thing with DAO collections? Do they come back as strings if you just look at the collection as if it was
If
converted?
you can
to a
read the
string?
pop-up there, it actually says quotes plus version ID close quotes. So it has come back as a string. Maybe if it's field brackets 0 comma brackets. Okay, that's something to try, isn't it? What do I get if I do that?
It's the first element.
Yeah.
Put it in
What
there.
comes back is a field object, isn't it? It's a
You
collection of
haven't-
field objects.
You lost the S, Peter.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, runtime operation. Okay, cool.
Try
I just wondered if field.
So I try CSTR in that, because you might get an automatic CSTR if you're
Yeah.
using it in a what's his name. Oh, you've put 0 as well. Try it without the index
So it's just the actual fields collection
Yeah.
itself, rather
Okay,
than the
right,
first
okay.
number.
and take out the CSTR this time,
Okay.
because that's sorry, I
Yeah. It's the
sound
same.
very bossy. Well,
Yeah, I would have expected that to get a invalid object type, because you're trying to actually do a
Yeah.
string operation on an object.
and
I'm not
presumably
gonna
it work. Peter, does it work with? I mean, this one just
It must be that the
has
collection has got
one-
a default property, which
Hang
is type string.
Yeah. Yeah.
it-
There's no IntelliSense beyond fields.
this collection has a single item in. Would this work the same way with multiple items? 'Cause
Well, no, if you look at his comments, if it had more than one, it would come back as a semicolon concatenated string of plus field names.
I'm
Okay, let's
I'm
pull this
aware
up.
of what his comments are saying,
Oh,
but
right, okay, sorry.
I'd like to
Right,
see. Oh, 2 options. Why are there? If there are 2 options, why did it just show the one?
We're heavily into the territory of I've never looked at this before because I've never needed to because it worked. But
Well, that's definitely something for me to play around with.
yeah, but you can see
very interesting.
there's your version ID name, and there's version number. That's the next column, but it's not. But it's hang on a mo. That is the fields. Hang on a mo.
Sorry,
this
that's
is-
the field of the record set, not the index
yeah.
you're looking at. It's the index.
yes.
It's the indexes fields that we wanted to look at.
TDEF indexes. Yeah, count 1.
Yeah.
Item 1.
Right. Yeah.
So I bring this back up again.
So it's an object index and it returns from
And
its
there's the
fields
name.
collection. No, that's the indexes. It's the fields of the index, isn't it? Index.
Yeah, that one.
That one. Yes, it's object index fields.
There's its name. There's the name.
Okay, I shall experiment. I shall look at that. It must
Very
be something to
interesting.
do with the default property of the fields collection, which allows
Yeah.
it to coerce it into a string. But that's fascinating because if that was a general thing in Deo, that could save a lot of code.
5 to 7, and we need to actually move on if we can.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully I've covered everything that's on these slides, but they're a good recap. The first form checks the domain to which I'm connected, checks the SQL server to which I'm connected and to which I should be connected, then reconnects if necessary. So that's an automatic process when the form loads. I've done it manually on the demo, but that's what happens when normal application is loaded. And then I show the diagnostics form or not, and I control that by domain and user, so that some users don't get all that debug information. Here I've hard coded it, so my domain static dev it was shown automatically. The second form, which is the debug form, gets a bunch of environment variables, and I mean that programmatically, not DOS environment variables, which can be fixed by the user. So things like domain name, username, stuff like that. I iterate through all the connections till I find one that's connected to a backend database, and I get that database information and put it on the form to tell them to what they're connected. There are 2 separate forms that load: the form AA, which is hidden, and form debug, which is shown. If you always show the debug information, you consolidate all those 2 forms into one. And then from that debug form, when you change or database or SQL server, you get mistake handling. So blanks, have you selected the current server to which you're already connected? Close the main menu, get confirmation, do the connection, update the forms, and then check the version at the end. Checking just calls a routine and tells the user. Refreshing seeks confirmation, does it, and then tells the user. Summary thoughts. Deployment. This is the reason why I'm doing all this. It's a great experience. It's one that doesn't fill me with any trepidation at all now when I'm doing this for clients. I compress it, I compile it, I compress it again just in case. Again, historically there was a point in time where second compression did actually improve things. Probably unnecessary now. So I've got the ACTDE for the client, and I send it to them, or quite often now I actually connect to their network and deploy it for them. Run it once, it connects to the right database because it's on a different domain, so it detects that, knows which server and database to use. And then if you're lucky, they might test the work I've done. If they're sensible, they actually preserve the reconnected ACTDE, so then when they distribute, there's no interaction at all, it just runs. So if they change the SQL server without saying it breaks, and that has happened to me once, change a network name without telling you it breaks, and that's been a situation if a company is consolidated or demerged and they change things. As I said earlier, if they steal the database on the front end, it won't work, but there are caveats to that statement. Things I will change. I'm planning to revert to the original connection if the database version has changed between the 2 databases. So I've got to just record to what they were connected and then flip it. You saw the code there. I just give it the parameters, server name, database name, and it will work, but I just haven't coded that yet. And then run the connection code again. And there is framework in there for more than one SQL server or database combination. There are placeholders there for you to do that if you need to do it. And that Energy Trust I've already referenced. That bug's now being fixed, and I did look through the code to see if it could have occurred anywhere else in it, and I couldn't find anything. Switching from a current version to a previous version database with a missing table will cause a crash. But if they've done that, they've been doing it for the wrong reasons anyway, so they ought to be back to you. And there is some caveats here that I could look at the backend version number table first, reconnect that firstly, determine that it's the wrong version, and tell the user before I do anything else, just back out that one database connection. It also depends on keeping numbering up to date. And if I do, all shall be well. Things you could change. I'm assuming DSN-less type connections to SQL pass through security. I could store more information in the local database table, list of local databases, so you get user ID and password authentication, but you will only introduce different security issues because you'll then have your user ID and password in a local table. And as I indicated, you can do this with other backends. You just got to capture the connection string, tweak it, and relink it. You could probably, you can link tables from different sources. So you could actually have a system front end that's talking to SQL, Oracle, Access, anything else on different servers per many combination. But you just need to know each table where it should be connected. So there's possibly some intelligence there that you need to integrate into that table. I can't be bothered because no one's needed it yet. Slides will be coming out. The ACTDB, the 32-bit ACTDB will be available very soon. The 64-bit ACTDB will be available as soon as I find time to fix the mistake that I found this afternoon. not the mistake of the bug. And I'll also deliver those 4 SQL databases so you can spread around. May reduce the content in them. So if anybody wants it, I could generate the T-SQL scripts to create those databases for you, but I think just restore from a .back file would be sufficient. Usual caveat, release as is. There's no support. That obviously ping me if you find a bug, if you use it. And if you can think of any improvements, that'd be great. There is credit comment in the code, and that's not just for me, that's for other parties as well. And I particularly want to acknowledge Andy Couch. He did a lot of the hard work of this 20 years ago. I picked it up and ran with it and created improvements myself, but he did the hardcore work at the center of it. So I'm very grateful for that and other work he's done over the years. And finally, with Colin's permission, some of you may know that I'm a cyclist who doesn't like cycling, but I do big Battle with Bike rides for Help for Heroes every year to raise money for the blokes. I'm back on the bike and I'm doing it again next year. And I this morning set up a Just Giving page for collection. So if anybody does use it or found the presentation today useful and wants to give some money to the blokes for the wounded, injured and sick who fought for us country, then please either click on the link or go to the use the QR code to get there. And with that, thank you very much.
You are a superstar, Peter, and thank you ever so much. And I encourage people to show their appreciation for Peter. First of all, if you can find it on the claps and so on now, but also I love the idea of actually showing appreciation by passing on a donation to Help for Heroes as well. And also, I'd just like to say that I've been using DSN-less connections for 15 plus years, very similar code to Peter's, and it reinforces my belief that it's actually the way to make connections for different clients as simple as possible. And you did a very clear explanation there, Peter, and the commenting throughout your code was superb, I thought. So thank you for that.
Thank
Just
you.
to say that if you just go back to the previous slide a second, no, two slides with that list of items to come, these will be put on a specialist page on my website, and it's depending on whether I can get them zipped together, they'll also go on the Access Europe website as well. But there I can only put in one zip file, whereas I can do several files on my site there. Thank you again, Peter. That was excellent. And as I said, we'll get those things to you as soon as we can. And next month, those of you who are expecting a session on mapping from Thomas Fock, that has been postponed until further notice for a number of reasons. And I approached Tom van Stiffhout and he agreed at incredibly short notice. So next month, we have, fresh from his success at DevCon, I don't know how many of you were at DevCon, but if you were, that was the official announcement or official release of Northwind 2.0. And Tom is doing a number of sessions to focus on different aspects of it. So even if you saw the previous one, next month from us will be different. And before I go over to Tom, I will just say that I've done specially for him, welcome to Northwind in Dutch. And Tom, how awful is that translation? Yeah, okay, I get the answer is that is not brilliant. All right, over to you.
All right. Yes, this is just a 5-minute tease of what we will be talking about in about a month. So as most of you already know, File New in Access should give you a view of the new Northwind icons. And you can then choose to download one and the other as well. I would certainly recommend you do that even ahead of next month's meeting. And if you start the Dev Edition, which is the one we will probably be focusing on the most, given this kind of audience, then it starts up like this. You have a familiar navigation pane, the orders form is open, that's also the first item in the ribbon. And this template is chock full of news, firsts, if you will. The first time that there was ever an Access template with a ribbon. The first time there was ever an Access template with an MIU list. The first time there was ever a template with reports with modern charts. I could go on and on. We have a large number of firsts, and we will not be able to touch on all of them. What we'd like to do in the upcoming meeting is to pick a few of those items and drill in much deeper so that you can really see how this code is used in the application. And we will also look at the VBA to understand how it was implemented. And I'm pretty sure that everyone will come away from that demo as, hey, there is some code that I can use. I've already heard this from several developers who have said, I'm refactoring some of my existing code, or I'm adding this to my code library because I want to use this in the future, and nothing pleases me more. So I want to drill into a few of those items and show you how it is done and give you that code with a bit more understanding so that you can very quickly add it to your own code. Indeed, sometimes when we strive to do that, it is only a few lines of code in a form, for example, to make a really nice way of validation work. We have kind of standardized that, put that in a module of its own, and in your form you just have 3 lines of code, and that make the whole validation thing work, including subforms. And that's maybe an example of what we could drill into. We haven't quite decided yet which exact items we will be touching on, but there will probably be 2 or 3, and everyone will be able to take away something from that presentation. So I'm really looking forward to doing that, I believe, early June, after we've done another one here for an American group. And this will just continue. We will continue to speak about different aspects of Northwind for a specific audience, drilling into new items a little bit deeper. And so if you look at the collection of presentations over the course of the next several months, you'll really get an in-depth understanding of it. Okay, so that's the tease. That's the 5-minute version of it.
Thank you. And leave that on the screen there for a second. Just wanted to say that for those who don't know, this has been a joint effort led by Tom, but also including George Hepworth, Dawn Taylor, George Young and Kim Young, who have been working together for well over a year now on the 2 different versions, much of which they've also spent on doing massive amount of documentation. There are, would you believe, 20 web pages now live for this, and this is gradually being localized to other countries, and they are aware it's not yet available in all countries, but that will, over a period of hopefully short time, will actually change. I know some countries can get it, some can't there. It isn't planned though, is it, Tom, to produce non-English language versions?
There are no plans to localize Northwind itself.
Right.
That would be something that Microsoft would have to do. That wasn't done with the previous version of the Northwind template. So efforts like what you are trying to do are very much appreciated and would be a lot of fun to see how far you can take that, what kind of challenges you run into.
I'll drag onto the screen. Here's the same screen that you were looking at. And again, it's not by any means perfect. But you will get a lot of the translations done for you. Mine, I made a deliberate decision not to translate data in my application translator, which actually has caused some challenges translating Northwind, because certain aspects, for example, if I go to the employees one, which I can find it, employee list, here's one I noticed here. You'll notice a lot of the captions are translated, but you've got recent orders for Stephen Thorpe. Would you briefly explain why that is different, Tom?
I think because that is text that actually comes out of the database, at least the part Stephen Thorpe. So it's probably a DLOOKUP or a reference to the voornaam and achternaam, first name, last name fields.
Actually, I think that's an expression in the control itself.
Yeah.
It's hard-coded into the expression for the label.
I am so grateful for you and other members of your team for agreeing to join us. So we'll let you know what areas Tom will concentrate on. That is indeed next month on the Wednesday, the 7th of June at exactly the same time, relatively speaking, as we are here. Yeah, that made Tom laugh. So it's obviously not ideal, that translation. Blame Google.
And,
Anything?
one fun thing you could do is do a double translate.
Yeah, I do that. And that's always interesting. In fact, I've taken it much further than that. But I've gone, not with this one, but with other databases where I've translated them, but 7 or 8 times, including to Arabic script, or Malayalam is one of my favorites, and then back to English. And surprisingly, it usually isn't too bad, but not always. Sometimes it goes badly wrong.
Have you heard the expression backflushing in manufacturing?
No.
Right, it was translated into Japanese for something. It came back as bottom washing.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you on that. Bringing the conversation down quite a long way here. Double Dutch, says somebody. John Clark's already used your error handler, which I was very impressed by. Thank you again to Peter for an excellent presentation. As I said, the materials will be available on my website. And if I go back to the previous slide, if I can get there, hellodogs.co.uk AU15, and that should be there, I think, within 24 hours or so. The video will go on YouTube. Thank you again also to Tom for next month's session, which will be largely on the developers version, but both are worth looking at. Oh, one thing, Tom, the interesting fact that the starter edition, where you made a deliberate policy to use macros as much as possible, because that's what many beginners would do, and how much of a learning curve that was for all of your group, having to learn to use them.
Yes, it was quite a challenge. The user interface is kind of clunky because there's a lot of modal there. So you cannot, like with VBA, switch back and forth between the VBA window and the Access window. And just the limitations of the language are significant. But that is also kind of a fun challenge of, well, you know, can you then still do something that you want to do? Can you find a way? And we got quite far, but at some point we also said, listen, there's no point in, if you know of the 5-minute VBA solution, and you know this might not be possible with macros, then by all means you can use VBA, but we used it as sparingly as possible.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, at that point, I think I will say thank you all for coming, and we'll hopefully see you all next month. Thank you all. See you soon.